Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Andrew Yang, who is an entrepreneur and author who's running for president as a Democrat in 2020. He has worked in startups and early stage growth companies as a founder or executive for almost 20 years. In 2011, he founded Venture for America, a national entrepreneurship fellowship that's helped create almost 3,000 jobs. In his book, The War on Normal People, he explains the mounting crisis of the automation of labor and makes the case for a freedom dividend, also known as a universal basic income of $1,000 a month for every American, as well as other policies to progress to the next stage of capitalism. So this is going to be interesting. You're back in New York right now. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Diane. Yeah, I'm in New York in our headquarters right now.
Well, we're in Arizona, so we're coming to you live. We're going to get this out on the radio and on YouTube. And I want to thank Hugh Ching to begin with, because he introduced us. And I've had some amazing guests on my show, from Patrick Friedman, Milton Friedman's grandson, Greg Newmark from Craigslist, Richard Stallman, GNU Linux creator. I mean, just a lot of really interesting guests. So thank you to Hugh for the introduction. And I was really interested in what you do before I found out about, your platform and everything else, just the company you created. I mean, you're a smart guy. Let's say you have studied economics and political science at Brown, and you went to law school at Columbia. So obviously you've got a pretty strong background. So I watched your Georgetown video, and I was fascinated by what led to your interest in creating your company in the first place, which is really foundational to understanding your platform, I think. So can you just give a little background of why you started your company and what led to this point in your life of going to the next step?
Sure. So as you said, I did go to law school in New York City. I graduated in '99, and I was an unhappy corporate attorney for 5 months. I thought it was just a terrible job. And anyone listening to this or watching this probably knows some unhappy corporate attorney somewhere. And so I thought two things were true. One, I did not want to do that job forever. And two, it was going to get harder to leave, not easier. So if those two things were true, I thought, well, I should leave immediately. So I left after 5 months to start a .com that did not work out in the first bubble. And then I went on to a couple of other startups and eventually became the CEO of an education company that helped people get into business school. And so I personally taught the analyst classes at Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley while I was the head of this company. And I saw so many young people who reminded me of me at the law firm, where they didn't like their jobs and they were kind of searching for meaning. And so in their case, they're going to hit the reset button and apply to business school. And so when my company was acquired in 2009, I made a list of the problems of the world. And the one I kept coming back to was that we had so many talented young people who were doing the same jobs in the same places over and over again. And they weren't really making themselves happy. They weren't really doing anything that economically or socially productive. And I thought it was something that needed to be improved on. So I started Venture for America, to your point, in 2011. I donated $120,000 of my own to seed the organization. And the goal of the organization is to recruit and train enterprising college graduates to help grow and then build companies in Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Birmingham, New Orleans, and other cities around the country. And so I did that work for a bit less than 7 years between 2011 and last year. And being in those communities made me realize a few things. One of them is just how profoundly we've affected so many parts of the country by automating away about 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and other parts of the country. And in my mind, that set of economic and social changes has led directly to Donald Trump winning the election of 2016. Because if you reflect on the location that these manufacturing jobs used to be in, they were in swing states in the Midwest that have now gone red. And my friends in Silicon Valley know that we're about to do the same thing to retail jobs, call center jobs, fast food jobs, truck driving jobs. which unfortunately are some of the most common jobs in the U.S. economy. So to your question, I spent 7 years trying to create jobs around the country, and we've created about 3,000 jobs, so I'm very proud. But I started to realize that we were pouring water into a bathtub that has a giant hole ripped in the bottom, and that we need to go much, much bigger. So that's why I'm running for president, to help advance our economy to the next stage of capitalism that will have people being the center of the economy as opposed to us being economic inputs into a larger system.
It's interesting as you were saying that. Just I had attended a Forbes summit that was in the Midwest, where we talked. People on stage were talking about how it used to be the hub. That was the Silicon Valley of its time, and then we had the Silicon Valley, and then what will be next? Kind of, we don't know, right? So what you're talking about is really important, because Elon Musk and everybody else is talking about their fear of what's going to happen with all this. Automation, what's going to happen to jobs. Not everybody's got an answer for what's going to happen. I can remember selling computer software in the early 80s, where everybody was concerned that computers were going to take over everybody's jobs, but then there were jobs created for people to run the computers. But it's a little different now, because there's so much being done by technology. So I was fascinated, because there's so many books that are kind of important that we could talk about. I know you were really impacted by Andy Stern's book, Raising the Floor. What about that? Were you thinking of running for president before reading that book, or did that just put you over the top, or can you tell that story?
Well, if you read that book, you might see why I would be compelled, because I think it ends actually saying that someone should run for president.
Can you say that again?
Oh, sure. So Andy Stern used to run the largest labor union in the U.S., the SEIU, and he wrote a book, Raising the Floor, that I found very, very compelling, because it wasn't just Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and technologists saying we're going to automate the jobs away, but the largest, most important labor union leader of his era said, the future of labor is no labor, we're screwed, and we need to move to universal basic income. And so I had lunch with him in February of 2017, and I asked him, what is the plan? How are we going to mainstream this? Because we only have 5 to 10 years before the truck drivers start getting sent home and all heck breaks loose, because the truckers, it's the most common job in 29 states,
right.
Average age 49, 94% male, 3.5 million of them. The odds of them losing their jobs are, in my mind, zero. So the fact that this is coming down the road. So I read this book by Andy Stern, and I had lunch with him. And when he said there is no plan, then I said, I will become the plan, and I'll run for president and make the American people see that we're in the midst of the greatest technological and economic shift in human history. And we're dealing with it in one of the worst ways terrible, which is by pretending it's not happening. Like, we're all just looking around being like, oh, I wonder why, I wonder why things feel the way they do. I wonder why our political system is so dysfunctional. I wonder why people seem so angry in certain regions. And the reason is that we're blasting away the major job categories in the US by the numbers. Our labor force participation rate has dropped to 62.9% right now, which is the same level as El Salvador and the Dominican Republic. And for whatever reason, our media is not addressing the elephant in the room, nor is our political establishment.
Well, it's a very big problem, and I know you've talked to other people about it. I think you said you sat down with Barack Obama and others, and people are interested in this topic, and I think a lot of people are worried about how to solve it. But what makes you think that this is the solution? Is this the only solution, to give everybody $1,000? And why that amount, and why everybody, even if you're rich or poor, or unless you're already getting Medicare or whatever,
Yeah. So, it's funny you mentioned Barack Obama, because I don't know if you saw, he came out for a universal basic income about 2 weeks ago in a speech in South Africa. So if it's happening economy-wide, which it is, there are going to be so many side effects, where, as an example, there are 5 million Americans who work in truck stops, motels, and diners that serve truckers. So if the trucks don't stop anymore, then entire towns are going to lose their reason for being. So my plan, as you say, is the freedom dividend, where every American adult receives $1,000 a month, free and clear, no questions asked. And the reason why, in my mind, this dramatic solution becomes necessary is because it's going to be very, very difficult for the government to parse out who's going to be affected by this displacement wave, like who's like a second order effect. How can you determine this? And our government's really bad at a lot of things. Our government would be very, very bad at trying to, frankly, figure this out and administer it quickly. We're much better off by taking the stance, which is completely true. We're all the shareholders and owners of the richest and most advanced society in the history of the world. We can easily afford a $1,000 dividend for every American. And the reason why $1,000 is such a great level is that our poverty line is $12,770. So you're pushing everyone to just below the poverty line. But virtually no one's going to quit their job on $1,000 a month because you can't really do a whole lot on $1,000 a month. So even if you're a server in a restaurant making $18,000 a year, if you quit your job, you take a 33% pay cut, which would be very, very bad. But if you keep your job, you're making $30,000, and all of a sudden you might be able to save a little bit of money or take your kid to a movie or any of a million things. So the $1,000 a month limit is high enough to make a really, really profound impact on the lives of many, many millions of Americans, but it's not so high that it starts to distort the labor market in a dramatic way.
Well, okay, so you say the cost of this is what, $2 trillion? Is that what the cost was, minus the 500 billion, I'm sorry, that people are already paying for these other programs. So it's what, $1.5 trillion? Is that what it costs?
Yeah, that's about right, which sounds like a lot until you consider that our economy is up to 19 trillion, 4 trillion in the last 10 years alone. And that if you were to grow the consumer economy by $2 trillion, which this would do, then you get back 500 billion in new tax receipts almost immediately. The big move you have to make is that we have to start harvesting the gains from new technologies, because the beneficiaries of artificial intelligence and software and automation will tend to be really big tech companies that don't pay a lot of taxes because they move it all through Ireland and say, we didn't make any money this quarter, and then we don't see any of that as the public. So what we have to do is we have to join every other industrialized country in the world by having a value-added tax. And because our economy is now so vast, a value-added tax at even half the European level would generate 800 billion in new revenue. So current spending of 500 to 600 billion, plus new tax revenue, plus value-added tax at half the European level, plus all of the direct cost savings we'd have because we're spending less on incarceration, homelessness, and healthcare. Because if you keep people out of the emergency room because they have $1,000 a month to take care of themselves better, one study showed that if you were to alleviate child poverty in the United States, it would grow the GDP by 700 billion a year because of better health outcomes, educational outcomes, mental health, worker productivity. There'd be a massive value add in terms of our investment in our people that I'm not even taking really into account in terms of how to pay for it. The truth is, if we were to do this, it would end up paying for itself in significant measure. So it's much more affordable than people think.
You know, it's interesting to think of the impact that some of these things have. I remember having somebody on my show was talking about, I think it was Tom's Shoes, where they gave a free pair of shoes away in another country to kids, as a good thing. You buy one pair, we give away another pair. But the causation and the correlation things are hard to really determine. This caused a problem for the shoemakers in that country. How much, you talk about research, what kind of research has been done to see the other impacts that doing this will do? I mean, say you charge Apple more, they're going to increase what they charge for their iPhone. So instead of having $1,000, now maybe you've got 900. Each person's going to have maybe a different amount to spend based on how much they buy. It gives you an incentive not to buy too much, I think, though, because they've raised their prices. So what do you say to that?
Well, there are a couple of things there. So one is the research as to the impact of giving everyone $1,000. And if you look at the studies, a number of things are very, very clear. Where children's nutrition and graduation rates go up, people's mental health improves, domestic violence goes down, hospital visits go down, depression and suicide go down. So these are the impacts you'd see on like the individual and the family level. And the research is very, very clear. Again, it's staggering how much of a difference $1,000 a month makes. Now, when you talk about other second order impacts like potential inflation, if you think about what's driving Americans crazy right now. It's inflation in one of three areas: housing, education, and healthcare. Most of our consumer goods have actually stayed quite under control in terms of pricing. And some of them, like clothes and media, have, if anything, gotten cheaper, or electronics, to your example. So the issue is not that purchasing power is driving inflation. The issue is that there are certain markets that aren't actually subject to genuine market action. Like, for example, education. If a college makes its tuition much, much higher, which they all are unfortunately doing, then people are like, well, don't have a choice. Like, I just have to take out bigger loans. And then the government's like, here are the loans. And so now we're up to 1.4 trillion in educational loans. And the default rate that's now past 11%. So that inflation is not being driven by people having more money. It's just the fact that colleges are gouging people. Same with healthcare providers. So it's not the case if you give people money that there would be rampant inflation. Unfortunately, the inflation that we're experiencing is being driven by some dysfunctional parts of the economy. And one of the things I want to do as president is to get both our healthcare and education costs under control through a number of ways. But housing's the trickiest, because housing, it's a gray area where it's not clear the federal government can even, they can do a few things with like HUD and whatnot, but a lot of that is local zoning regs and the fact that a lot of economic activity is concentrating in a handful of metropolitan areas. It's a very long-winded way of saying inflation is not being driven by people having money.
Well, okay, so you give them the $1,000. You already said it's not a ton of money, right? So, but you have what, a social contract that they'll use this for getting more educated, getting maybe starting their own companies, doing other things, helping the economy by buying more. I mean, there's all these benefits, right? But I also saw you do an interview where you said that young men are, you give them that, time off, they'll sit home and play video games. How do you keep the guys or girls from getting this money and just staying home playing video games with it?
Well, it's primarily guys. You guys got to look at the numbers.
Yeah.
So the generational challenge really is to create an economy that has touch points for unskilled men in particular. And this is not a speculative problem anymore. Almost 1 out of 5 prime working age American men in between the ages of 21 and 30 have not worked a day in the last year. And according to the studies, they spend 75% of that time on the computer, mostly playing video games. And so the cycle for men, unskilled young men in particular, is to start playing video games, and you're actually, this may surprise some people watching or listening to this, their happiness level is actually pretty high for the first 5 years or so, just hanging out playing video games. Mm-hmm. And then they start to get depressed in their 30s when they realize that this is actually their life and there's like no place to go. And then they tend to graduate to substance abuse and self-destructive behaviors, and then things start going south. So this is primarily a male problem. Women do not do this. If you have women who are pushed out of the workforce, for example, they tend to engage in education and community activities. Men do not do those things. Unemployed men actually volunteer at lower rates if they're unemployed, because they just don't want to. There really is like a male set of issues, and so the test really is would getting $1,000 a month be more likely to get someone out of their parents' basement from playing video games all the time? Because then with that money, they could actually go out and do things, maybe move someplace and try and make something happen for themselves. Right now, they're at home playing video games in part because it's one of the cheapest forms of entertainment there is. After you get a console, you don't have to spend much money. On a per hour basis, it can be like pennies on the hour. So video games are some of the cheapest entertainment around. And the hope is that by putting money into these people's pockets, it will actually empower them to try and put themselves in position to get out and hopefully participate in the real economy.
Okay, so is this theoretical? I mean, I know Finland had examples, but they didn't do it with everybody. And you've got, I was looking at Sam Altman, Hughes, the Stockton City experiments, different experiments out there. Can you talk to those experiments to see what you think has been successful or what they did correctly or incorrectly?
Yeah, so there's a lot of really compelling data from around the world, from different time periods. Like right now, there's a ton of stuff from the developing world. If you look at stuff in just US and Canada, you have a bunch of trials in the 60s and 70s, which had very clear data. And then it's been fairly lacking for quite some time until recently. In Europe, you do have a Finland study that they did not continue. And then Ireland was working on something. And there are other examples from around the world. So the data from a while ago in the US and Canada is incredibly positive. And there was another study in the 90s in North Carolina that was also extraordinarily positive, where it actually showed that children's personalities change to become more conscientious and agreeable if their families got more cash. And those two traits are very good indicators of both academic and personal success. And so the studies that I've seen have been really invigorating. The one state that actually has universal basic income or something exactly analogous is Alaska, where everyone in Alaska right now gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked, from the petroleum dividend. And in Alaska, studies have shown that it has created thousands of jobs, increased and improved children's health and nutrition, and lowered income inequality. And it's wildly popular in a deeply conservative state because Alaska, it was implemented by a Republican governor who asked this question: who would you rather get the oil money, the government who's just going to waste it on something stupid, or you? And then Alaskans were like, me. And then now everyone gets the money and they love it. So that's the kind of thing that we have to make happen in the US using the oil of today, which is technology. So the technological advances will help fund this freedom dividend for all of us to be able to build a new human-centered economy that's based more upon our goals and values and also the needs in our communities, which would be really the opposite of what's being sold on some sides as this trickle-down economy where you give very wealthy corporations and individuals money and you hope it trickles down. We're going to build the ground-up economy, and that's the big move we have to make, but it would be based upon something very similar to what they're doing in Alaska using technological advances.
Okay, so if you're taxing these companies, is there only certain companies you're taxing? Are they the ones that have artificial intelligence, or is there certain, how do you determine which companies? And if you take this money from these companies, then it goes through the government to get paid back to us. So kind of, it comes to mind, you pay into Social Security, you hope you get it back, but then they've spent it somewhere else and you don't get it. How do you know you're going to get it? Who are you taxing? And can you just elaborate on that? Sure.
So value-added tax, again, is being used by every other industrialized economy already. So every company knows what to do because they have accountants who are making it happen in other parts of the world. And it would fall on just about every piece of consumption. So every Amazon purchase, every Google search, there's a sliver that would go into this value-added tax. So if you've ever traveled in Europe, which I'm sure you have, but anyone listening to this, where you see on your receipt it says VAT, and you're like, what's that? So that's what that is. And then that money, and the great thing is that instead of Social Security where you have to wait for decades maybe to get that money back, we're going to get that money back immediately. We're going to get that money back every month. So it's not one of those things where it's going to go into the government's coffers and you hope it comes back out. It's going to come back out immediately. But it would be paid on most every consumption transaction in our economy, which in a vacuum would sound rough, but you have to remember we're increasing most everyone's purchasing power by $12,000 a year. And so only about the top 5 or 6% of Americans would see any decline in their purchasing power, because for most people, you're going to get $12,000, your family's going to get $24,000 or $36,000, and you consume much less than the $360,000 you would need to consume in order to be hurt by this at all.
Well, okay, so what is your political background? I've had Steve Forbes on my show, and I was interested in why he ran for office, and I asked him that, and I'm interested in why you said why you were running for office based on your interest in this topic, and after reading that book and all that. But had you political aspirations prior to that? What have you done politically, and are you jumping right in at the highest level? I think, I'm just curious what your background is.
Yeah, of course. So I was an appointee in the Obama administration to an honorary position as a presidential ambassador of global entrepreneurship, but I've not held elected office. I took it upon myself to start this entrepreneurship organization because I thought that it would help push the country in the right direction. I thought, this country has been great to me, and I've done well, so I should try and give back in like the best way I could. And as an entrepreneur, training and empowering hundreds of young entrepreneurs seemed like a very natural thing to do. But now I believe that we're facing the greatest challenges in decades in terms of this economic and technological set of changes that are coming down the pike. And if you reflect on it, everyone listening to this can see the stores closing in their areas. Everyone seeing this or hearing this has a supercomputer in their pocket. And so some things that would have been considered totally science fiction are now very, very real for us. Artificial intelligence is real and coming online. Autonomous vehicles are real and coming to a road near you, especially in Arizona where you are. I think they're piloting the heck out of them there. And the conventional wisdom is about to collapse around us, as we've seen in this past number of years, where people who think that Americans are magically going to transition into these unknown new jobs are in for a very, very rude shock. Because if you look at the numbers, almost half of the people who lost their manufacturing jobs in Michigan and Indiana left the workforce for good and never worked again. And about a quarter of them filed for disability, which is an incredible number. There are now more Americans on disability than work in construction. So the reason I'm running for president is to wake us all up to the fact that we're in the middle of historic, unprecedented changes, and our political establishment needs to get with the program, but they're too busy engaged in food fights from decades ago, arguing about policies that are marginal compared to the true challenges of what we're facing right now.
Well, you're talking about people losing trucking jobs or different types of jobs that are not the same as running a business. And there's a certain personality that wants to be an entrepreneur or a certain skill set. What if you don't want to run your own company, but the type of jobs are gone that you're used to doing? Is there somewhere in the middle, or are you seeing that we need all these entrepreneurs? What are the other options for people?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head, Diane, and you know this. Like I'm a serial entrepreneur. Most people don't want to be entrepreneurs. Or a lot of people who want to be entrepreneurs are not cut out for it. I mean, it's like we've lionized like that type of work to a degree that in many ways is like not honest or productive. So most people want to wake up and do a job that values them and they're treated well and they feel like they're good at it. And so when you do take those jobs away, as we're doing right now to millions of Americans, there's like a real void that follows. And if there's nothing to fill that void, what fills it is anger, despair, self-destruction, and early death. Honestly, our life expectancy has declined for the last 2 years. This as what you do, but our life expectancy has declined because of a surge in suicides and drug overdoses, where now 7 Americans are dying of drugs every hour. This is the real set of challenges we're going through. And you're 100% right. It's not like everyone's just going to wake up and be like, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, like time to go like be my own boss. That's another line of bullshit that's being sold to people, when like 94% of the new jobs created since 2005 are gig economy jobs, contractor jobs, like temp jobs.
Right.
And then people are being pitched, it's like, oh, you're your own boss. Like look at you driving your Uber, like you can make your own schedule. Meanwhile, there are no benefits, there's no future, and they're going to automate that job in a minute. So I just want to say you're totally right that everyone being an entrepreneur is not a real solution or a real approach to the future.
Well, I've had Gerald Chertavian on my show, and he's the head of Year Up. I don't know if you're familiar with that company, but
I'm a big Gerald fan. Year Up is great. Gerald's great.
Great. And I'm very interested in what they do, because they get young people from areas that aren't very, high income areas, and help them to get a year under their belt of experience to go out to get a job, to get educated, whatever, to get them to that Year Up level. And in my work, I study curiosities, because I believe, for innovation to get improved, to get to higher levels, you have to be curious. You have to be willing to not fear things, to not, have these things hold you back. Why not spend the money on that? And why have the control in the consumer's hands, or the public's hands? Why not offer better education or better training or better whatever for free? Is there a reason to do it that way?
Okay, so if you look at the numbers on government-sponsored retraining, the effectiveness levels, according to independent studies, range between 0% and 37%. And that's being very, very generous. The reality is, if we paid for government-funded retraining for people, after the retraining was over, they would still be essentially where they were before the retraining. They would not be able to magically conjure up new jobs for themselves, and they would not be able to find new jobs that suited them in their environment. If you look at our college success rates right now, 32% of Americans graduate from a four-year college. Now that level has stayed more or less constant, even though we've been pushing a lot more people into college. Again, 1.4 trillion in school loans. The underemployment rate right now for recent college graduates in this country is 44%. That is 44% of people who go through a college degree, have $38,000 in debt, have a job that does not require a college degree. And so we have to be honest about the fact that even if you go through our tier 1 system, which only the top third of Americans go through, there's still about a 50-50 chance you're not going to get a job that requires a college degree. So thinking that education and retraining is going to be the way out assumes that if we can educate someone, that they're going to be able to create a job for themselves. The reality right now is that our 6-year completion rate for college is down to 59%. In other words, 41% of people who start college don't finish within 6 years. And a lot of them still owe loans on that or debt on that, because the school will charge you even if you don't get the degree. Like, you finish like a year or two and then you don't get a degree, they still like, hey, you owe us, like $30,000, $40,000. So we have to start being honest about what our institutions can and can't do. And if we were to use our nation's resources and put everyone through like college or community college, you'd wind up with like much bigger colleges and still the same number of jobs, more or less, waiting for them on the other end.
What's going to make people want to finish their degree programs just because you give the money to them? I've taught more than 1,000 business courses, and I've seen what you're talking about. A lot of students some of them are in the programs because they want the money that goes along with it. They don't even spend the money they're given to buy books because they just live off of that money. And I mean, there's ways around it. And, there's going to be people who work the system. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but there are people who will go different directions. What's going to change those people just by giving them the money instead of having it, done a different way? You're still going to have a certain mentality. Is there a root cause that do we need to have Gerald be the head of your administration in some way running this to get people to think differently? I mean, what do we do to change that?
I mean, Europe does incredible work, and certainly I'd put Gerald in charge of all sorts of things, because he's actually made it happen on the ground in real life for thousands of young Americans who are from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's incredible. It just goes to show what happens sometimes if you invest directly in people and you care the way that Gerald and Europe care. Where you show up and say, hey, I'm not here just to take your money. I'm going to try and mentor you and develop you and connect you to opportunities, and the whole thing is like a mammoth investment in a labor of love in that case, which really isn't a contrast with most educational experiences. Like, most educational experiences are much closer to a business transaction where like I show up, I give you the money, you like give me the content, and hopefully I get a degree, and hopefully I can use that in the job market. So the challenge that lies in front of us, and the reason why I think giving people the money directly is a much better way to go, is we have to start building a different variety of pathways to people, where we're not saying like college is the only answer. I mean, one very, very big thing we should invest in is technical education, vocational programs, apprenticeship. Only 6% of American high school students are in a technical track. In Germany, that percentage is 59%. So think about that. They're like 10x us in terms of people working with their hands and being able to do work that in many cases is going to be much trickier to automate. And those jobs are going to be with us for a long time. We're not going to be able to automate away like air conditioning, repair, or plumbing for a long time, maybe ever, because it's a sort of tricky, like fine-tuned manual work. As an example, like hairdressers, we're never going to automate away hairdressers because it'd be insane to try. You'd have like an Edward Scissorhands robot and everyone would be totally freaked out. Whereas like having a human do it, it's like totally reasonable. So we have to stop overselling college, and we have to start trying to build much more robust pipelines towards sustainable opportunities in this middle skill area, where there are approximately 15 million unfilled jobs right now because Americans don't have the right training or skills, or they're not in the right place.
Well, you bring up interesting points about the future of education, how we value degree programs, and millennials are thinking differently than Xers, and Xers different than boomers, and every generation thinks a little bit differently. And I've had a lot of people ask me about this just because of my background. And when I worked at the Forbes School of Business and other schools, you meet all these people who want to know what's going to happen in the future for education. And some people think if it might be a la carte, because younger generations just want to pick this, pick that, pick, whatever it is that's applicable, certificate programs or whatever. But then a lot of what's happening, we're seeing, is they're missing soft skills. They're not able to communicate well. You're losing emotional intelligence or, critical thinking, different things. And even the humanities are dropping out. Are we losing the glue that makes you a well-rounded person if you start picking and choosing?
Yeah, and one of the major problems here, Diane, is that we now see education as more or less an economic transaction. It's like, if I go to college, I better get a good job at the other end of this. And if I don't, then there's something wrong. And then you have to teach me something that's going to be professionally applicable. And it's one reason why the humanities right now is getting marginalized, where it's like, hey, can you get a job as an English major or philosophy major? It's like, no, study something more practical like finance or accounting or coding. And so that's one of the big challenges for educational institutions, is that they had an original mission, which back in the day actually had nothing to do with trying to prepare you for the workforce. It was trying to prepare you to be a citizen or like a leader or a moral person. I mean, most of our major universities actually had religious origins. And so it was about trying to teach you like how to be moral, more or less. And then that's gotten completely transformed into something technocratic. And there are a couple of like flopping like appendages that sort of resemble like the old days, but like most of the time they've just moved on. And so the pressures for schools is to somehow marry those two and to try and be like a true educational institution while serving all of these market-based pressures from parents, from students, from employers to some extent, and then try and make it work. And you see the pressure that they're under, where they're struggling more and more with this, because the market forces are not being generous or kind to people who study anything other than a handful of disciplines. And that the market right now is saying, like, go into coding or finance or STEM, and then other than that, we're going to reward you at much lower levels.
Yeah, it's a really challenging time in education, and what I keep hearing is just so many conflicting viewpoints, and you're seeing a lot of conflicting viewpoints in politics in general, much more than I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I mean, we talked about why you want to run for president, but I think that as we talk about that, this is one part of your platform. Just like when Steve Forbes was on my show, he had the flat tax. I mean, everybody has their major focus.
Yep.
But you want to give a little bit of a broader range of where you stand on overall big topics of what's your main focus? I mean, you don't have to go into depth, but
oh, sure.
I would like to know a little more depth about what exactly you stand for.
Yes, well, we have two slogans here in the campaign. One is humanity first, and then the second is invest in people. And so the key theme is to try and build a new human-centered economy that focuses on our own goals and values. So part of this is universal basic income, but the second is trying to get healthcare off the backs of American families and businesses, because right now, if you get sick or injured, you're not only worried about trying to get well, you're trying to figure out whether you can afford treatment. unfortunately, for everybody. And that's true. Like, I have insurance, but it still is like a huge stressor. It's like, oh man, like, does my insurance cover this? Like, well, like, how much am I going to be out of pocket? So we have to move towards a single payer public option or a Medicare for all. And that's actually going to help businesses too, because as a CEO, it's a massive disincentive to hire someone if you have to account for their healthcare costs. It's really unfortunate, but as like as a business owner, you look at it and be like, I'd prefer not to hire people have to pay for their health insurance, or I'll make them a temp worker or a contractor. The third big theme is that we need to start shifting the way we measure economic progress, because GDP is going to keep going up and up even as more Americans get pushed aside. And so I'm for, and this is going to speak to some of the values you're asking about. So I think our measurements should include things like childhood success rates, mental health and freedom from substance abuse, median income and wealth, environmental sustainability, proportion of elderly in quality situations, and then build a more nuanced economy, because GDP is something we invented during the Great Depression just to see how we were doing or how badly we were doing. And even the inventor of GDP said this is a terrible measurement for national well-being. So of course, then we decided to use it for national well-being. And he said things like parenthood should be included in GDP, which it is not. And defense spending should not be included in GDP because it doesn't do us any good, which of course we ignored. So now the defense industry is like run amok. So these are some of the big themes of the campaign, but Humanity First is around trying to compensate women for the unrecognized and unrewarded work that so many women do, because women do the majority of the uncompensated work in society. Communities of color who have lower access to opportunities. Like the freedom dividend will hopefully help make our economy more human, really, for all of us. And it will take the some of like the incredible pressure off where even successful people in this economy feel like they're constantly scrambling and racing against the clock, that we're fighting for resources for our kids, and like if we ever stop, we're going to get like thrown aside. So and that's where people are doing well. Like, people are watching this, so like that kind of describes your life, and you're probably doing a-okay. So we have to rewrite the rules of our economy to serve our goals and values. But if you're interested in other elements of my campaign, if you go to yang2020.com, I have 72 policies, and they cover everything from what we've discussed to banning robocalls, to paying NCAA athletes, to making Puerto Rico a state. They're all things that strike me as what you would do if you wanted to build a human-centered society.
So on the scale of really far left to really far right, where would you put yourself?
I'm certainly left-leaning on most social priorities. Like, I'm very pro-choice and and a number of other things. But one of my friends said to me that it's not left or right, it's forward at this point. And I think that there have been a lot of there's been a lot of polarization, a lot of like ideological, in my mind, just misconceptions or miscommunications. So I'd consider myself left, like according to most people's definition of left on like a lot of the social issues. But some of the things that I advocate for are actually things that many conservatives and libertarians love. Like Milton Friedman was for universal basic income, and he's like the patron saint to to like conservative economists. So I'd say it's a bit of a mixture.
Yeah, I had Patry, his grandson, on the show, and Milton Friedman is, every course I teach practically, you do hear about him. And I'm curious what you think of the current administration, of how they're doing. Were you surprised that Trump won? You said you knew that a lot of these states were a factor in his ability to win the last election. How is he doing in your opinion, and what's your whole take on the whole Trump?
Well, I was surprised that he won, truthfully. I mean, it's possible that I should have had a better perspective. I saw anything I encountered as like, well, it's just one data point. It's a big country, and like the data all says Hillary's going to win. So, listen to the data. And then of course Trump wins, and then you look at it and say, okay, what does this mean? And to me, what it means is that the American people are really, really hungry for a different type of government, a more responsive government, and they were and are rightfully distressed and angry and concerned about the future of this country, which to me they should be concerned, because we're blasting away most of the major labor categories and then pretending we're not. I mean, it's sort of a major problem, and so that's the problem that got Donald Trump elected. Unfortunately, I do think his solutions tend to be off base, where it's not like blaming immigrants or loading up on tariffs is going to bring all these jobs back. I mean, they clearly won't. That we need to start trying to transition to a different form of economy. So what I see it is that Donald Trump is the manifestation of many of the problems that we've left unaddressed for decades. And now we have to speed up and get our acts together and start trying to address those problems, which is going to be a massive generational challenge. But if we don't address that challenge, we're just going to keep on eroding and disintegrating on the ground.
Well, you said you talked to Barack Obama and that he's recently talked about universal basic income. What did he have any issues with what you had proposed and what you had in mind, or did you get that deep into conversation about that with him?
Well, when I was in the White House, we weren't really talking about universal basic income. We were talking about like beautiful, wholesome entrepreneurship things. But if you look at some of his quotes on this, what he says is that automation and new technologies are going to make it so that the relationship between work and making a living is going to get stretched out more and more, and that we need to start thinking about universal basic income. So he and I see the same things and are trying to galvanize energy around the same solutions. And so that's really what my campaign's about, is trying to get America to focus on the real problems and the real solutions.
So I'm curious, what presidents have inspired you? I mean, who's out there that you just go, oh, I thought they did a great job?
I'm a big Teddy Roosevelt fan. I'm actually Teddy Roosevelt's great granddaughter's godfather. So I suppose I have a bit of a spiritual relationship and affinity there. But I think that his approach to governing is what we need today, where he was just trying to fix some big structural problems, and unfortunately at this point in our country's history, we're facing equally large structural problems that need to be met and addressed, and we're really not up for it at all, where it's like the things that we need to address aren't even on the table very often. And our faith in our government is at a record low among many Americans, because our government seems so backward and dysfunctional and is decades behind. So we've got our work cut out for us, but I'm a big Teddy Roosevelt fan.
Well, I remember talking to Steve Forbes about something. He was on my show, and plus I've worked with him at Forbes in different areas. And when we've talked about this, he said for him, the biggest thing, he's seen a lot of change in what you can talk about at cocktail parties is that you can't even talk politics. In the past, people could voice opinions and you can have conversations. And now it's so polarizing that I'm sure anybody watching this YouTube, you're going to have a lot of the people who are maybe far to the right, not, wanting to hear things that government has so much involvement. How do you get people to get together if there's such a big difference between this side and this side? And what do you have a plan for that?
I think that my plan is to be very, very straightforward and honest and talk about the real problems. And I have to say, Diane, one thing that an advisor said to me is that politics in the U.S. are like a horseshoe. This is not a big good horseshoe. It's like that, where the ends start coming together again. And by this, what they meant was that there are a lot of people that were sympathetic to both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, who in theory are the opposite ends of the spectrum, but they actually start curving towards each other. And I have many, many supporters who are Trump supporters, who like certain aspects of me or my platform, maybe that I'm an outsider, an entrepreneur, someone who doesn't talk like the rest of the political establishment. And I have many Bernie supporters who are big fans of mine because it seems like I have some of the same goals and priorities. So the thing I'm confident in is that Americans are hungry for a real set of solutions and a figure who seems apolitical. And that, to me, is where most of America is right now. Like, independents outnumber both Republicans and Democrats by the numbers. I mean, like, the media makes it seem like there are these two camps, like, equally battling it out, which at the extremes, like, that might be true. But most of us are not at those extremes. Most of us are just trying to wait for our government to get its act together. And I believe I'm someone who can help our government accelerate very, very quickly.
So if you get to the final stage, if you're up there debating with Trump or whoever will be on the other side of that, is there anything that we're going to find out crazy about you, that you've got this wild past or some unusual thing? You got a chance to come out now, be proactive and just...
Oh, thank you, Diane. Thank you for that opportunity. I'm actually quite dull. I'm like a family man, 2 young kids. And I was very nerdy when I was younger. And so I was always stressed out about doing something that would like mess with my brain wiring. So as a result, it's been pretty dull. Like, friends who've known me from back when can make fun of some of my fashion choices, because I was sort of like this angsty alternative like type who like listened to The Cure and the Smiths and like, was very morose. But in terms of like dramatic revelations, like it'd be kind of tough. Like, I'm pretty dull.
How does your wife feel about you doing this? I mean, if you made it into the presidential office, your whole life is completely different. I mean, forever.
Well, my wife is Christian and believes that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. That there's like a purpose that people find at various points, and I certainly feel like I'm stepping up because I see how much this country is just focusing on the wrong things and needs to like get a different type of vision. So my wife, I'm happy to say, sees that need as well. She's even doing things like advising me on my speeches. She might even watch this video later and then tell me, like how it was in various dimensions. Because she's a former marketing executive. She used to do brand management, so she actually has some very, very, very acute points of view about a lot of things. But she's on board and enthusiastic.
Well, it's expensive to run for president. So are you independently wealthy? How are you going to cover this?
Well, I'm happy to say that we get contributions every day from people around the country. Our average contribution is about $11. And so we do have like a Bernie-esque popular enthusiasm that is having people. And I got to say, the people that are donating are like, Walmart sales associates in Mississippi and like truck drivers in Missouri, like people from around the country who see that I'm trying to address like the real problems. And so that's how we're going to fund this campaign. And I'm glad to say we've already raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in that way. And it's just going to keep on gathering steam as more and more people figure out that we need to rewrite the rules of the economy together. And if I'm successful and we're successful in getting me elected, I'm going to give everyone in America $12,000 a year. And that's like a much bigger, more direct improvement in people's ways of life than anything anyone else is talking about.
Well, this has been really fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of people want to know if they want to donate to Yang 2020. What do they go to yang2020.com? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, yang2020.com. We have a campaign now called One for Humanity, where if you just give $1, it's a sign that you want this sort of economy. You can also just Google my name, Andrew Yang. I've now overwhelmed every other Andrew Yang in terms of web presence. And the book is called The War on Normal People. I'll try and hold it up to the camera. So this book is about how we're automating away the major jobs and we need to transition to a new form of economy. But please do visit us at yang2020.com and help make this campaign real, because we do not have much time to address the real problems of this era.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for being on the show. And this has been really fascinating. And I hope a lot of people check out your site, and we're very anxious to see what 2020 brings.
Thank you, Diane. Such a pleasure. Look forward to seeing you in person soon.